this is one, to give you an opportunity to ask questions that you would ordinarily ask me anyway as a tutor, but also to kind of go through the things that are a little bit different this year because it's very strange this year. So I'm going to open up the slides here. Okay, so you should be able to see that header slide now.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, so thanks for joining me here. I'm very excited to have you here, and I'm very excited to share all of this with you. This is one of my favourite things, although that might make me a bit sad. I'm hoping that at the end of this, you'll feel a bit more confident about what you can expect for the next year and the ways that you could help your child through their GCSEs. The way that's going to work today, I'm going to present for about 30 minutes, hopefully on the content that you expected me to, and that's all going to be recorded so that I can share with people that couldn't attend in person. You can ask any questions you want to during the presentation. You should have up there a link if you want to enter questions in, or you can just ask the questions if you prefer. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to stop the recording, and then if you want to, you can just ask the questions on the camera, but that's just to give people the option that they can ask questions without being recorded. Okay. After the presentation, then the recording is going to be available to everybody that signed up. I'll email you the link to the recording, and then I won't use your email address any further without your permission. But if you want to contact me, then you're going to have then my email address if you wanted to ask me any questions, or if you wanted to work with me any further. So I'm just going to confirm that that is recording, having promised that. Right. Yeah, that's recording. Good. There we go. Okay, so who am I and why am I talking about this? So I'm Georgina Green. I'm the owner and the manager of Green Tutors, which I started in 2012. I'm a personal tutor. I provide maths and biology tuition for GCSEs. And I manage a team of tutors who are all scientists and engineers, and they provide maths and science, which is STEM tuition up to A level. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering and maths. And I intentionally hire tutors who've worked in STEM fields because they have a clear passion for those subjects and they can share that passion with their students. So I'm a firm believer that learning should be fun and interesting. And if that's the case, then it's more memorable, it's more enjoyable. Students are more likely to take that with them, and they benefit from building them positive relationships with their tutors. I'm also a scientist myself with a degree in forensic science. So I'm not really using that one at the moment. I worked at GSK Pharma R&D for 13 years, since 2007. And then since the lockdown, when my lab closed, I've been volunteering in the Cambridge COVID Diagnostic Testing Centre because they put out a call for volunteers with a science background, and I was at home in my pyjamas. I'm currently still working there, so I'm only delivering my lessons 1 day a week. I've got a free Facebook group for parents of GCSE students. That's called Turn GCSE Stress into Exam Success. And then since the school's closed, I opened a second Facebook group to be able to help teachers and tutors to take their services online if they hadn't previously, and to be able to continue supporting their students through the lockdown. That's been a fantastically successful project. I've been delighted to see the impact that it's made on people's lives, and I've met some really wonderful people through that group and seen the great things that they've been doing to support students through this very odd year. It's been really challenging for them as well as for the students. So what we're going to go through today, I'm going to summarise the plans that the government have shared on how the next school year should look, how the curriculum might change, and how the exams might take place. And I'm also going to share with you my top tips that I share with my own students on study skills that students need to get the top grades at GCSE, and how to reduce anxiety for teens as the exams get closer. And then I've also got a special bonus for anybody that stays to the end as a thank you. Okay. So social distancing is not really anything new at this point. Gavin Williamson, who's the Secretary of State for Education, has confirmed that the schools and colleges will be reopening fully from September, and that students will be expected to attend, with the reintroduction of the fines for missing any school time. So that wasn't a popular decision all round. Those within the HCP are expected to be included in that, so that means everybody should be back to school in September. And then local lockdowns might mean that some schools in specific areas would remain closed or close after that. There's clearly going to have to be safety measures in place to protect students and staff, and that's largely going to be up to the schools to implement themselves. So there could be differences between the schools. They're required to put that into place before schools open. So I think it's going to be the same as the way that shops and bars and restaurants opened, in that they've been given notice of the date that they're going to open, and they've got that time to implement it with the guidance that they've had from the government. Ofsted is supposed to be visiting schools in the autumn to be able to discuss how they've managed that return to full education, share that with the whole sector, and then return to full Ofsted inspections from January. So it sounds like the idea is that they'll be back to operations by then. So the measures will include minimising contact with individuals who are unwell, same as at the moment. So those who have symptoms, or if someone in their household has symptoms, they don't attend. There's going to be a small number of testing kits in the schools, so that students who wouldn't be able to get access to the testing centres can take those home for them and their family to test. Standard good hygiene measures, cleaning hands more often than usual, the catch it, bin it, kill it idea. Then the frequently touched surfaces would be cleaned more regularly with detergents and bleach. Minimising contact and mixing with other students and with other staff. So they'll alter as much as possible the school environment, the classroom layout, maybe attending with dining areas. The timetables could change. They could have staggered break times. It's been suggested that they could have staggered start times for year groups. That's not been a popular suggestion, because many parents have got students in more than 1 year, so that would make the drop-offs really awkward. So where possible, schools would be encouraged to attend within small bubbles. Currently, they're not requiring that staff and students wear face masks, but that is, of course, an option for anyone that's anxious about the return to school. And as we've seen, it might come in several months later, so who knows? So should any cases occur within a specific school, then Public Health England gets involved, and they consult on what measures that school has to take to keep everybody within there safe. There's been a lot of discussion throughout the lockdown on the impact of students who were supposed to sit their exams this summer. But there's also a significant impact to the students who are going to be sitting their exams next summer. So understandably, those students have been asking for some changes to the curriculum in 2021 to account for the fact that they've missed so much time in the classroom, and for how different the school year is going to look for them when they do actually go back in September. So on the 18th of June, the Secretary of State for Education wrote to Sally Collier, who's Ofqual's chief regulator, and set out his department's objectives for how the exams and assessments should go ahead in the next year. So what absolutely should be included, and how they recommended that things could be made more accessible. Then on the 2nd of July, so quite quickly afterwards, Ofqual published their proposals on the changes to the assessments in 2021 based on his guidance. And then they had a consultation on getting people's feedback on what they thought of that proposal. That consultation is now closed, and they're expecting that the outcome is going to be shared early August, so before the 2020 students get their results. They're subject to change because they were a proposal, but there were some pretty solid ideas in there. I'm going to be keeping a close eye out on the announcements so that I can share when it's confirmed. You can, if you want to, find all of those documents on the gov.uk and Ofqual web pages. But I'm sure you're busy people, and they're very boring documents, so you've probably got more interesting things to do in your life. I don't. This stuff is very critical to my clients, to my business, and to me, so I've been reading all of them as they're published, and that's why I've summarised them for you here. So the main aims of the measures were to be able to free up teaching time. to give some extra freedom to teachers so that they can choose which subjects they cover, because all schools will cover the curriculum in a different order. So if they just cut a blanket part out, then there'd be some students that were disadvantaged. And then to ensure fairness in the delivery of the curriculum, in the assessment, and then in the grading of all of the subjects for all levels in 2021. Maths and science are obviously deemed very important to the ongoing learning of all students. So their curriculum are expected to be covered in full for the 2021 exam. I knew it already, but we've just been confirmed that they're the most important, and English, but we'll just add that on the end. So there's some adaptations to free up the teaching time proposed. They proposed adaptations in the number of subjects to give teachers more time to cover the full content and to help to relieve the pressure on students. So they'll still be covering the same schedule of subjects that they were signed up to for their GCSEs, but they might remove the requirement to record the spoken language assessment that everybody has to do for GCSE English. So previously they might be in a room with their teacher and other people. The whole assessment would be recorded and sent for examiners. At the moment, they've suggested that they just wouldn't record that. It would be the student and the teacher in the room. It would save a lot of teacher time if they didn't have to do that. And it would probably reduce a lot of student anxiety if they weren't being watched and recorded while they did that. So that's a nice suggestion. For GCSE science, they've suggested that students would observe rather than actually participate in practical science work, which would again save a lot of time, make it a bit less interesting and less engaging, but it is possible to see the entire experiment without actually doing it. Art and design students who ordinarily would do a 2-day exam at the end of their GCSE course would be assessed just on their portfolio work, which they would have to produce anyway. So that will save the need for an exam. And again, probably reduce some student stress in not having to do that. For the future public health safeguards, so there's some subjects that could be particularly affected if public health safeguards were needed in the next academic year. It has been suggested that there might be another spike, and it's been suggested at various different points throughout the next year. So they've proposed changes to the performance rules for dance and drama. Ordinarily, that would include some performance element. And then the design and technology students who would ordinarily be using machinery in the class together, it was suggested that the teachers would just demonstrate how that machinery was used and the students wouldn't use it themselves. So all of these things are designed at reducing teacher time and reducing the amount of work that needs to be covered in the year. And understandably, they remove some of the engaging elements out of the curriculum, which is a bit of a shame for the students involved. And everyone involved has said that that is a short-term measure due to the pandemic, and it is definitely not the way that GCSEs should be taught. And going forward, it is not the things that will be adopted. So sampling was suggested as well. Secretary of State, pictured here, explained in his letter that he's not minded to specify the changes for the DFE content which forms the foundation for GCSE, AS and A-level qualifications, which is good, so they're not changing the content included. But he did ask Ofqual to explore the use of content sampling in the question papers and then increasing the use of optional questions. So all of the content would be included in the exams, but students wouldn't answer all of the questions in the exams. So teachers would then have the options on which content they might remove from their teaching plans, which kind of accounts for the fact that they would have taught them in different areas. It could potentially cause confusion for the students in the exams, though, because those papers don't currently exist. So they don't have practice papers that look like that, and they might struggle to identify the topics that they're not answering. I actually did the same thing in my A-level biology. So we had the option to break out into year groups and study different biochemistry topics, and then the exam included all of the biochemistry topics, and we were supposed to go through to the one that we did. Now, apparently I wasn't paying attention when they said that, and I thought the entire year was studying the same thing and the exam was for everybody. So I studied food sciences, and I opened it up to some nanotechnology, and I answered the questions on nanotechnology, and then I turned the page and there was the questions on food sciences. I thought, Oops, I was supposed to answer those. Probably made up most of the answers on nanotechnology. So we can't assume that students are going to know how they can answer an exam that they've never seen before. So the DfE, which is responsible for the content, has confirmed that that option shouldn't be used for the GCSE English language, literature, for the maths and sciences, because like I said, those core subjects are the fundamental ones for the student's ability to progress. It's not going to apply to any of the AS or A-level exams either. So the proposals already introduce lots of opportunities to free up time, and they've decided that they wouldn't make any changes to those. That hasn't been the case for history, ancient history and geography. So they cover quite a wide curriculum ordinarily. So of course proposed that centres would have greater choice over what they teach in those subjects, and they could reduce the curriculum in those subjects instead. So that would introduce a choice of topics on which students would be required to answer questions in their exams, with only one topic remaining mandatory, so they wouldn't have the option to drop that topic, but they could pick which other ones weren't included. For GCSE geography, they'd be removing the fieldwork element, so again, taking out the fun bits. For the exams, so they've confirmed that the exams would be expected to go ahead in 2021, but they might be happening later in the year, so from the 7th of June, potentially. The aim would be then that it wouldn't cause a delay in the issuing of results, which ordinarily comes out somewhere between the 20th and 26th of August. Because they're already issued then within a couple of weeks of the start of the new term. And students need those results then to be able to start the courses that they would be starting in the first week of September. They wouldn't be allowed to take equations, formulae, English texts that are currently not allowed into the exams in 2021. I did consider it as a way to make exams more accessible, but then decided that it would be too distracting for students to have that information with them in the exams. I don't know. Another option new for 2021 is the National Tutoring Programme. So significant government funding is being provided to help people to catch up on their lost learning. And out of that budget, which I think is in total $1 billion, 350 million is allocated to this national tutoring programme for the most disadvantaged pupils. So the evidence shows that 6 to 12 weeks of tutoring for a disadvantaged pupil can result in 5 months of school catch-up. And we see this every year at Green Tutors, which is no surprise to me. So when a struggling student is achieving 2 or more grades higher at school after a couple of months with one of our tutors, it's no secret that the intensive, the personalisation of that tuition can make it a massive difference to students. So I'm really delighted that this is now government backed. They've made that statement that tutoring could have a massive impact on people's lives. From the 2020 to 2021 school year, the National Tutoring Programme is going to make high quality tuition available to state maintained primary and secondary schools to provide that additional support to help pupils who've missed out the most as a result of school closures. And so that's from the 2020-21 school year. So I think it's going to continue long after that. There's already a really wide attainment gap between pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and their classmates, and that's growing quite significantly where schools are closed. That's always the case. So there's students that don't have even internet access, they don't have devices to be able to access online lessons, they don't have home environments that are really conducive to study. Maybe some of them are carers, and that's much more likely for students in disadvantaged backgrounds that this national tutoring programme targets. The access to tutoring is usually limited to the schools and the parents that can most afford it. So it's estimated that around 80% of disadvantaged pupils don't currently have access to quality tuition. So the National Tutoring Programme is aiming to support schools in addressing that. There'll be 2 pillars to it. So there'll be NTP partners. So schools will be able to access heavily subsidised, not free, heavily subsidised tutoring from an approved list of tuition partners. So those approved tuition partners will all be subject to quality, safeguarding and evaluation standards, would be given support and funding to reach as many disadvantaged pupils as possible. Then there'll also be NTP coaches. So those will be trained graduates employed by the schools in the most disadvantaged areas to be able to provide an intensive catch-up support to their pupils, and then allow the teachers in those schools to focus on their own classrooms. The teachers and school leaders will decide which approach best fits their needs and which tuition partners they want to work with, which pupils would benefit most from that additional tuition. So I imagine they'll be given their budget and they decide how they're going to spend it. The design of the National Tutoring Programme has been created in collaboration between 4 charities shown here. So that's the Education Endowment Foundation, and the Sutton Trust, Impetus and Nesta, and they'll be involved in the initial delivery of the programme. So I'm really excited to see how this could be implemented. As the Tutors Association has been quite involved in the discussions with the government on how that should be implemented, I think it's highly likely that their own tutors' code of conduct is a good indication of the standard that the tutors will be held to be part of this programme. So that means that they'd require a DBS certificate, they'd require evidence of safeguarding measures, and they'd require evaluation methods, so some relevant experience and demonstrable results with their own students. It hasn't yet been announced how that's going to be implemented, besides the fact that it would all be directly through student schools. Okay, so that's all the government waffle. Hopefully that wasn't too tedious. That was many pages and many videos worth of information. I've tried to condense as much as possible there. So I'm gonna now move on to the study tips that I share with my students. So there's many different things, but these are the things that I think make the biggest impact and the biggest transition to independent learning. And I think it's independent learning skills that are going to really set students apart in 2021 exams, because there's so much time spent working at home alone this year that if students aren't able to work in that way, it's going to be a real struggle for them. So the first thing that I always say is to know your curriculum. So there's likely to be changes to the curriculum this year, and they're still to be announced. But you can download a copy of your current curriculum from the exam board that your child is sitting their exam with. If you're not sure which exam board that is, you can usually find the information on the school's web pages. The most common curriculum in the UK in England for maths is Edexcel, and the most common curriculum in England for science is AQA. That could vary, so it's still worth checking with your school which exam board your child is taking. The curriculum is designed for schools, and it's somewhat like the prospectus for selling the curriculum to them. So it's a bit dry, but it does detail exactly which exams are included and how long they are, what content is included in the exam. So it's a good checklist for note-taking and revision purposes. And I always recommend that students start there with their revision. You can just skip through the first few pages until you get to the bit that says subject content. So you can get started now with the subjects that aren't changing, the maths, science and English, and then other subjects could vary more widely, particularly the humanities. I always tell students to start early. So although summer 2021 seems a long way off, that time is going to pass really quickly, and especially once the term starts again in September. So effective study takes practice, and I always recommend students get started as soon as possible so that they can build that practice in. I would encourage them to make a rough calendar for the year or buy an academic year diary, keep track of all the key dates relevant to them, keep track of how much time they have until those important dates. And then I also recommend that they spread the work that they have to cover over that time to get an idea of how much work they should be doing each week. So once they've got a copy of their curriculum, that will include all of the subjects that are covered within their curriculum. And I don't mean, so if you open up science curriculum, it lists in the contents 8 topics. But if you look into those 8 topics, they've got quite big subtopics. So those subtopics that you would maybe cover within a week are things that they should be looking to list. And how many of those do they have to cover? How long do they have to cover them? How can they spread that out to make sure they get through all of it? So that saves the last minute panic that lots of students get as the exams get closer. Often that results in either the ostrich approach, where they pretend the exams aren't happening, give up all hope of doing well, and just live on Netflix, or the alternative last minute panic revision where they just stop sleeping, and that's completely ineffective and obviously detrimental to their health. So panic options, not a good idea. It's definitely a good idea to start early. I've put on the right hand side here a rough template of the year. This is a kind of balance of the things that have been shared of key dates and what the year usually looks like. Obviously that's all subject to change. The plans are due to be announced in August on how the proposals have actually been adapted. Students are due to go back to school in September. After that, it gets a bit vague. So ordinarily, mock exams would be in November. Some schools do additional in January, and then the exams ordinarily start in May, but potentially could start in June next year. So that should be what the next year would look like, and I would work towards those key dates at the moment. So another thing I'd share is the idea of active revision, to make sure that the time spent in revision is actually working. So the brain has got two different types of memory. You've got your short-term memory, you've got your long-term memory. What I'm saying to you now is running through your short-term memory so that you can follow what I'm saying. You understand each of the words in the sentence, and then your short-term memory puts them into a sentence as it's presented to you. That entire sentence is currently at the forefront of your mind because I'm sure you're paying attention to every word that I'm saying. And if I were to ask you in 5 minutes' time what I've just said now, you'd probably be able to give me a summary, but I'd be surprised if you could repeat everything word for word. If I were to ask you tomorrow, you'd probably remember most of what I said, but you would undoubtedly have forgotten a lot of it because that's how it works. That's why I'm recording it. If I asked you again next week, most of it would have been forgotten unless you've actively processed the information into your long-term memory. So that's what happens to most students. It's most of what students get told in their lessons. If they're just sitting there and they're listening to the teacher, they're probably going to start looking out the window, and their brain will drift off completely passively. They're not intentionally ignoring them, but that's just what happens, and they're going to forget most of what they're told. They need to do something with that information, which is why the ever popular homework gets set. If they don't look at the work in between the lessons, it's just gone. They won't remember it, so they won't be able to continue from that work with the next lesson, and they'll just start putting themselves behind. Active learning methods mean that you're understanding the information as it's presented, assessing it with practice questions, reprocessing the information into a good set of notes, progressing to questions that are slightly different to those demonstrated, maybe a bit harder, and then reviewing your understanding of that before progressing on to the next step. So that's the process of learn, apply, adapt, and review that all effective learning takes. That's what teachers are doing through the course of the term. In a classroom setting, though, it's very easy for disengaged students to fall out of that learning loop. Oh. And yeah, don't touch the laptop. Right, it's very easy for students to fall out of that learning loop. I don't know. So teachers would rely on group assessments to assess the individual performance. They have to pick up on a student that's falling behind before that presents itself as a big learning gap. So end of term assessment, probably they've missed quite a bit there to catch up on. In one-to-one tuition, tutors should be able to pick up on that immediately. They should be able to see that students become disengaged or misunderstood something immediately, carry out that loop multiple times within the course of a lesson. So that's how there's that massive difference, and they can accelerate the learning over classroom teaching. That 6 to 12 weeks of tuition, you can quite easily see then how that translates to 5 months of classroom time. So any effective study techniques that a student might do on their own would require some intensive working in 30 to 60-minute blocks. Post that, most students would have lost their attention span, and it's not productive for them to carry on. So that intensive working, assessing their work, making good sets of notes on what they're listening to is what I tell students to do in their class. A lot of them, they don't want to sit there and be the swot that's writing notes. But I quite frequently get told that they were listening to every word that the teacher said, but it didn't make any sense, and they couldn't remember any of it. If they're sitting there writing down what the teacher's saying, or turning it into a diagram, or just noting down the key words, it doesn't matter if what they've written is complete nonsense. The fact that they're trying to do that means that their information is going a little bit more deeply into their brain, and they're more likely to remember it. So from that, I tell students to make good notes. So the notes that I see from my own students vary quite widely. Some are absolutely beautiful and should be published and should be passed on to future students. Some are barely notes. They shouldn't be called notes. So quite often I can see a page and it's just got a heading, nothing else, just the title, and then they gave up. That's likely to set me off on a big rant about the value of good note taking, but that's their problem. I always encourage students to make good notes in their lessons, actually in their lessons, even if the teacher hasn't told them to make notes, because as I explained, that active learning means that more information passes from short-term into long-term memory, which is where they're going to pull it back from their exams. So if they're writing down everything that their teacher says as they say it, then they're more likely to remember it after the lesson, even if they never looked at their notes again. Ideally, they will look at those notes again and they'll use them for their revision. Most students would like to have neat notes, and there's benefit to taking the time to organise that information into some aesthetically pleasing way. So at the very least, it makes it more likely that they're going to want to look at them again because they're proud of their work. But it also is another form of active revision. So copying notes into a new set of notes is revising that information. Those notes should be checked against the curriculum so that they're complete. So I check my students' notes and I can flag any key points that they've missed from the curriculum. At this point, I could probably recite you the specification anyway, the number of times I've looked at it. It's hard for a student to do that themselves, which is why I suggest that they have that specification as a checklist, just to mark off when they do the review that they've got everything included in their notes. And if they don't, then they should be asking, I think I've missed this bit, or I don't understand this bit, I don't have any notes on this, can you help? They could ask their teacher, they can ask a tutor, they could ask their classmates if they actually took better notes, just to make sure that they've got the complete set for when they're revising for their exams later in the year. And then when all of the content has been covered, the next step is to practice using that information with real exams. So a large part of the exam success comes from understanding the exams themselves. So it's one thing to be able to answer 20 trigonometry questions when you're presented with a worksheet on trigonometry and it says trigonometry at the front and you've just written down the notes about trigonometry from the teacher's board. It's a completely different thing to identify that question in the exam requires, and then remember how to apply them under stress. That's where students come a little bit undone. So that's why it's critical that the students would practice their knowledge with past papers from their own exam board so that they know what to expect. Again, a little bit at a disadvantage because the exams might not look like that in 2021 if you've got these optional questions, but that won't be the case for the English exams, the maths and science exams, they will be the same. So once they've done the practice papers, they should mark the paper themselves using the exam board mark scheme. I know a lot of parents do that for students, and they have been while they've been doing the homeschooling. That's like where parents have had to play the teacher, they've taken on the examiner approach as well. But it's actually beneficial for students to mark their own work because then they get used to interpreting the mark scheme, and they get more experience with how marks are achieved in the exams, how the answers should be presented to get all of the marks. And that's a learning experience for them as well. So they should be doing that throughout year 11 in preparation for mocks. Ordinarily, by the time students have gone into year 11, they've actually covered most of the curriculum. And then because the mock exams happen in November, a large part of year 11 is practice papers anyway. Obviously this year that's different because students missed the school they would have been doing since March, and quite a lot of that would be covering curriculum. I would recommend that students are still doing a lot of practice papers throughout year 11. You can download a selection of the past papers from the exam board's website, but they might look a bit different this year after the announcements in August. Okay, so I've been talking for over half an hour here, which is quite an effort. Probably not for me, that's what I do all the time. But I just wanted to give you guys the option to ask questions. So I'm going to come back out of here and stop recording you. If you wanted to ask some questions.